Last time on the American Justice Podcast.
My name is Brandon Woodruff. I'm 31 years old. I was arrested for capital murder in the deaths of my parents, Norma and Dennis Woodruff, and I did not commit this crime.
The sheriff deputies decided that it would be important for the jury to see the house as they found it. So they didn't turn on any lights, and they go stumbling through the house in the dark, filming and knocking things over.
There is an epidemic in America's criminal justice system: the prosecution and conviction of innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Welcome to American Justice. The American Justice Podcast Army works to free men and women wronged by the criminal justice system. It's not only about the innocent who have been imprisoned, but also the victims of the crimes as well. No one deserves justice more than them. And now, here's your host, Scott Poggensee.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the American Justice Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Poggensee. When we left off last episode, we were starting to talk about the crime scene and the processing of it. However, before we continue with that, I think it's necessary to go through the case and explain who all of the main characters are. This case is very complicated, and there are a lot of different players, but I'll do my best to navigate you through the twists and turns that will soon ensue. First, let's go back to the beginning for some background on Dennis and Norma Woodruff. Dennis Dale Woodruff was born September 26, 1962, at Wadley Hospital in Texarkana, Texas. Norma Faye Johnston was born February 9th, 1963, also in Texarkana. For those of you who don't know, Texarkana is on the Texas-Arkansas border, and the town was made famous by a serial killer dubbed the Phantom Killer back in the 1940s. Several books, films, and folklore stories put Texarkana on the map, but not necessarily for the reasons that the locals would prefer. One other oddity about this small town is that there's actually two Texarkanas. Much like Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri, there's Texarkana, Texas, and Texarkana, Arkansas. Even though they were both born in the Texas side, they both grew up in Arkansas. Dennis and Norma both went to Texarkana High School throughout the mid to late 1970s. Dennis graduated in 1980, Norma in 1981. They were both in the band at Arkansas High School, and one of them got on the wrong bus for a band trip to Ireland. From the time Dennis laid eyes on Norma in high school, he was instantly in love, even though he never said anything other than hi on the bus ride. However, once they got to Ireland, the two spent their whole trip together, talking and getting to know each other. Norma had sworn off dating for at least 6 months due to the ending of a recent relationship, but she had already caught Dennis's eye. After a persistent 6 months of asking her out, flowers, good conversation, and inseparable companionship, she finally agreed to go steady. Dennis's mom, Bonnie, says the two were really opposites. Norma was more of an outdoorsy type and loved horses, sports, and nature. And Dennis was more of a cooking type and liked being indoors. He loved music and concerts. And more than anything, he loved Dolly Parton. Despite their differences, Dennis and Norma shared an undeniable spark. When Dennis graduated from Arkansas High School in 1980, he went to Centenary College in Shreveport, Louisiana. Within a semester, he'd missed Norma so much that he moved back and went to work for the family furniture business in Texarkana. When Norma graduated high school the next year, they were married in a typical 80s fashion style wedding, complete with a lime green and brown color scheme. Dennis and Norma had two adorable children, Charla, born in 1985, and Brandon, born in 1986. In 1987, they moved to a small suburb outside of Dallas called Heath. Norma worked as a CPA and Dennis as a quality control engineer. Throughout the rest of the 80s and 90s, they lived in and around the Rockwall area. Brandon Woodruff, at the time of his parents' murders, was a 19-year-old kid. He's been described by those who knew him best as a naive cowboy who had recently started to come out of his shell. A caterpillar, if you will, exploring his newly found gay wings. Brandon's number one passion in life at that time was animals. He trained horses and showed animals, earning many, many ribbons, prizes, and scholarships. He would also show cows, dogs, and horses for other people in competitions. Charla Woodruff was Brandon's 20-year-old sister, attending college at Southern Arkansas University at the time of this tragedy. She was in the process of earning her degree in criminal justice. She also initiated the creation of a school organization that escorted women who feared for their safety on campus back to their dorm rooms. Charla was, by all accounts, a very complex character. Next, let's talk about some of the people that make up the reason that Brandon was arrested in the first place. As I mentioned in episode 1, there's Brandon's shit-kicker friends, Mike Etherington, Joe Hageman, and Dustin Perry. Let's not forget about them. Oh, trust me, we won't. We'll be hearing a lot about them all throughout this season. Finally, lead investigator, Ranger Sergeant Jeffrey Collins. At the time of this incident, Ranger Collins was assigned to the Major Crimes Investigation Unit that covered Hunt County along with several neighboring counties. Before the professional processing of the crime scene began, Ranger Collins suggested to the others in attendance that they should enter the residence in the exact same way they found it. This included filming the scene in complete darkness without the aid of any interior lighting. Wait, did I say professional processing? I meant to say fumbling. Sure, they had flashlights at their disposal, but the officials stumbled around the residence, knocking several items over and disturbing the virginity of the crime scene. For visual reference, just watch any random televised paranormal show. No, I'm not making this up. This is later proven by still photographs, which were taken after the lights were finally turned on. Here's a reading of Ranger Collins' actual investigative report.
Ranger Sergeant Collins Investigative Report, Section 1.8. Ranger Sergeant Collins recommended to investigators that the interior of the residence be documented with a video camera before a search was conducted of the residence and anything was moved. Ranger Sergeant Collins suggested that the videotape footage should be taken to document the residence in the condition it was found by investigators. It was suggested that no lights be turned on that were not already turned on in the residence, and that nothing be moved prior to the documentation of the scene as found by investigators.
The Roy City residence was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath mobile home with 2 entry points. Imagine it's divided into 3 sections: the north end, the south end, and the middle. The south end of the trailer had 2 guest bedrooms, each with a closet, and it also contained the 1 guest bathroom. The middle of the trailer had the front entryway and the living room, and the north end of the trailer had the master bedroom with the master bath, and just on the other side of the dividing wall was the kitchen and the side entry. The mobile home sat on 2+ acres of land, and the few neighbors were more than a stone's throw away. Before I go on, just a word of warning for those with weak stomachs. I am going to describe the crime scene in detail. Now, normally, for those of you that I just described, I would recommend that you skip over the next couple of minutes. But everything that I'm going to state during that time is important to the case and its outcome. Stay strong, people. You can do it. I don't particularly like talking about the gory details myself, But I do feel that it's important you understand exactly what the investigators found when they entered the Woodruffs' home, other than darkness, of course. When they finally gained entry after the warrant was signed, what they found can only be described as horrifying. Dennis was found on the couch in the living room, and he was wearing a t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants. He was sitting upright with his head tilted back, his eyes open, looking toward the ceiling, and his body leaning straight back slightly. There was dried blood all over his head, face, neck, and flowing down his shirt to a pool of blood between his legs on the couch cushion. He had 1 gunshot wound to the mouth and 9 stab wounds around his head, neck, and shoulders. Interestingly, he also had 2 stab wounds to the back of his neck. Norma was sitting on Dennis's right-hand side in a slouched position, almost as if she was trying to crawl underneath Dennis to hide from the impending attack. Norma had 4 gunshot wounds to her head and neck area, and 1 gunshot wound that entered through the back of her right hand. She also had 1 stab wound just to the left of her sternum above the left breast. Between Dennis and Norma was a large pooling of blood that had come to rest and dried up between the 2 dead bodies. There was a small cardboard box sitting in front of the couch in the place that a coffee table normally would be, and had several drops of blood on it and some blood spatter. There was also a trail of blood going from the couch to the guest bathroom, stopping just short of the restroom. For the rest of the evening, the sheriff's detectives and Ranger Collins would document the crime scene and take a videotape of it. Unfortunately, it was 9 p.m. by the time they got around to videotaping, and all the video documentation of the crime scene would be in the dark with the lights off. Remember, Ranger Collins wanted to film the crime scene in the exact same way it was found, in total darkness. Personally, it almost begs the question of why darkness? Was there something the investigators were attempting to recreate? Or was it just something that needed to remain hidden? As the investigators stumbled around the house in the dark, they disturbed items in this very important, newly discovered crime scene. There were items on the floor and on the counters that would look different when they would eventually turn the lights on and take photographs. No one knows the extent of which items were disturbed and not the way that they originally were. This would only be the beginning of what has been described as an inept and amateurish investigation. Throughout the night, the Texas Rangers and the sheriff's deputies continued to catalog and disseminate this capital murder crime scene. They would eventually call it off around 3 a.m. and head back home, agreeing to meet up the next day. The bodies were taken to the Dallas County Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences for an autopsy the next morning. At approximately 9 a.m., Texas Ranger Jeffrey Collins and Sheriff's Deputy Joel Gibson attended the autopsy of both Dennis and Norma Woodruff in Dallas. Not much new information was learned during the autopsy, but when they left at approximately 10:30 a.m., the first in a line of very mysterious and odd occurrences happened. Detective Gibson received a call from dispatch stating that a woman had called and had information about the, quote, Woodruff murders and needed to talk to the lead investigator. The timing of this call is disturbing because at the time, no one even knew it was a murder. As described later by multiple family members, even the family wasn't told that Dennis and Norma were murdered until many days after the bodies were discovered. Was it a murder-suicide? Was it a rabid animal attack? After all, there were no weapons found at the scene. Or was it a vicious fight between 2 feuding matrimonious partners? No one knew. Well, No one except whoever was on the other end of that phone call. The anonymous caller would originally not want to give her name, and she called the sheriff's department using the star 67 to block her caller ID. Eventually, after calling back several times, the caller finally identified herself as Norma Etherington. Wait, Etherington. That name sounds awful familiar. Oh yes, this was the mother of Brandon's shit-kicker school friend, Mike Etherington. Ms. Etherington called for the express reason to point the finger at Dennis and Norma's son, Brandon. She later came in and gave a written statement. Here's what Detective Joel Gibson had to say about the strange occurrence.
Joel Gibson Investigative Report, Supplemental. While at the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office, Investigator Gibson was contacted by Charla Campbell, who was employed at the Hunt County Sheriff's Office as a records clerk, stating that she had received a phone call from a female that stated that she worked for the United States Treasury Department and that she might have some information that could be helpful to our investigation. The female refused to give her name or phone number and requested to speak to the investigator that was working on the investigation into the deaths of Dennis and Norma Woodruff. Investigator Gibson also advised Charla Campbell, if the unidentified female called back, to give her Investigator Gibson's cell phone number. A short time later, Investigator Gibson received a call from a woman who advised her name was Norma Etherington. She advised she'd worked for the United States Treasury Department and that she knew Dennis and Norma through 4-H. Norma Etherington asked if investigators had any suspects in the case. Investigator Gibson stated that there were no suspects at the present time. Norma Etherington stated that her son Mike Etherington and Brandon Woodruff were in 4-H together. She stated that Brandon Woodruff and Mike Etherington were best friends until their senior year. She advised that both graduated from Rockwall High School in 2004. Norma Etherington stated that Dennis and Norma Woodruff were very nice people. She stated that Norma was a member of the 4-H board and appeared to have no enemies. Norma stated that during Brandon Woodruff's senior year, he began to separate from his friends and began dressing differently. Norma Etherington also stated that there were rumors that Brandon Woodruff was leading an alternate lifestyle. Investigator Gibson advised Norma Etherington that investigators were going to continue to work their investigation and could possibly need to recontact her at a later date.
Ranger Collins met with Lieutenant Simpson of the Hunt County Sheriff's Office after returning from the autopsies. How did Norma Etherington know the Woodruffs had been murdered before anyone else? No one in authority bothered to ask. If they did, it was never documented. In fact, here's what was documented from Ranger Collins.
Ranger Sergeant Collins Investigative Report, Sections 1.3. Ranger Sergeant Collins was also informed by Lieutenant Simpson that information had come in from a parent of one of Brandon Woodruff's high school friends that Brandon Woodruff may be leading a double life. Lieutenant Simpson was told that Brandon Woodruff had apparently been experimenting with homosexual activities. Lieutenant Simpson was also informed that Brandon Woodruff was known to lie to his parents about his whereabouts and that Brandon Woodruff made statements about hating his parents. Lieutenant Simpson advised that she would follow up on the information.
These accusations, rather than facts and evidence, would eventually lay much of the groundwork for the future arrest warrant and prosecution team's interest during the trial. After this meeting, Ranger Collins and Detective Gibson headed back to Royce City to continue processing the crime scene. Along with them was a gaggle of detectives and sheriff's deputies. The first thing they did was spray luminol all over the crime scene to see if they could pick up any bloodstains that weren't obvious. The luminol was able to alert to several stains on the carpet leading away from the couch, in and around the guest bathroom, sink, and bathtub, and leading into the guest bedroom. The accuracy of this information would later come into question, but for now, this is what the investigators were going on. They secured the crime scene and finished processing at around 11 p.m. the night of Wednesday, October 19th, 2005. The next day, while Ranger Collins was at the Heath house checking it out and preparing a search warrant for it, he got word that a neighbor of Dennis and Norma's named Randall Lunds had some information that the investigators might need to know. Ranger Collins immediately headed back to his office to meet with Mr. Lunds. Randall Lunds told Ranger Collins that he had known Dennis and Norma for almost 10 years, ever since they moved to Heath. When Ranger Collins asked about the important information he had about Dennis and Norma's murders, he couldn't even remember the small details. He couldn't even remember Dennis and Norma's names.
What was the purpose for you calling? Why did you call? What made you decide that you needed to call?
What made me decide I needed to call was I can't even remember their name, I'm sorry.
Dennis
and
Norma
Woodruff.
Okay.
Mr. Lunds told Ranger Collins that on the night of the murders, he saw Brandon at the Heath house around 10 or 11 p.m. You see, he told Ranger Collins that Dennis and Norma had entrusted him to keep an eye on their house since he was the next-door neighbor and Dennis and Norma wouldn't be there a lot due to moving into their new house in Royce City. Mr. Lunds stated that he remembered specifically the time that he saw Brandon because his routine was always to watch TV until the 10 p.m. news and then start his routine to head to bed. After he'd laid down, but before he went to sleep, he heard some commotion next door at the Woodruff's house. He got up, went to his front living room, and had a straight-on view of the Woodruff's front yard. He said he saw Brandon in his pickup truck. Thinking to himself that there was nothing to see here since it was just Brandon at his own house in his own truck, Mr. Lunds returned to bed and drifted off to sleep. The exact timing of this would later come into question because Mr. Lunds honestly couldn't narrow it down, except for between 10 and 11 p.m. After completing the interview with Lunds, Ranger Collins returned to Hunt County. On the way back, he drove between the Woodruff residence in Royce City and the one in Heath, noting that it only took about 20 minutes to travel between them. Using this information, Collins concluded that if Brandon did in fact leave the Royce City address at 6:30 p.m. on Sunday, October 16th, as he'd claimed, then traveled to the Heath residence while en route back to Abilene Christian University, Brandon would have been at the Heath residence around 7 p.m. instead of between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. as Lunds had claimed. Since the phone call with Brandon's mother and grandmother lasted between 9 and 9:30 p.m., the drive would have allowed enough time for that last known contact to be able to travel to the Heath home and seen by Lunds. Trust me, we will get into the timeline in great depth soon, because it sets up the main reason that Ranger Collins zoomed in on Brandon as his main, well, let's be honest, only suspect. The parade of biased, half-informed witnesses continued. Still en route back to Hunt County Criminal Justice Center, Ranger Collins was once again contacted by Lieutenant Janie Simpson. She advised him that a female was coming in to provide information on a stolen pistol that may have been connected with the murders of Dennis and Norma Woodruff. Ranger Collins was asked to return to the Hunt County Sheriff's Office ASAP. Next week, we'll discuss the Lee family, the Woodruff's funeral, and a magical missing gun. It would be alleged that Brandon was guilty because he had access to this gun. However, as you'll see from this clip of Brandon's attorney, Catherine Ferguson, many other people had access as well.
That individual had equal access as did Brandon. There were a whole host of teenagers who had equal access. There were a whole host of anybody that had equal access to that weapon. It wasn't like it was secured in a gun safe and locked away. I mean, anybody wandering through that house could have probably picked it up. And that's the other thing. It's a cowboy shooter, so it's going to be like a .45. That's not a small gun. How are you going to get that and then hide it in your pants, hide it in, I mean, how are you going to get that and get it out of the house without being noticed?
We'll see you next week.
The American Justice Podcast is owned and copyrighted by Atua Productions, LLC. Your host is Scott Poggensee, and your writer is C. Derick Miller. This episode has been produced and mixed by Wall Studios. The theme music for the American Justice Podcast has been created and composed by Josh DeRosa. Scripted and recorded episodes are published every Sunday morning, with follow-up Q&A episodes released on Fridays. You can find the Q&A episodes on YouTube by searching for American Justice Podcast. Atua Productions aims for this to be an interactive podcast where you, the audience, has a great amount of influence on the content of our shows. You can interact with us in several ways. First, and most preferred, is you can leave us a voicemail. Our phone number is 972-942-0444. Be sure to leave your name and the city you're calling from, along with whether or not we can use your voice on the air. If Facebook is more your style, you can log on to our Facebook page at facebook.com/American Justice Podcast. Feel free to leave a comment, or you can message us on Messenger if you have a more pressing question or issue. If you would like to blog about the show, then you can log on to AmericanJusticePodcast.com and tell us what you think there. You can find many of the documents discussed in this episode there as well. If you are a tweeter, you can also voice your opinion on Twitter at AJusticePodcast. If you would like to support the show, you can do so in a couple different ways. First, consider visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/AJPodcast. We have different levels of support that include t-shirts, guest call-in spots, and early access to our podcast and YouTube shows. Next, you can like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get notifications of when we publish episodes. We would also very much appreciate it if you could give us a 5-star review. If you have any comments about the show, or more importantly, any tips on the case we're discussing, please call 972-942-0444 and leave us a message. After all, if the subject of our podcast is innocent, that means someone out there is guilty. American Justice Army? Let's find them.